Hi, I'm Lisa Van Gammert from ldsteach.org, and I'm sharing today some tips for reading the scriptures out loud in class and in your gospel classroom. So almost every class is going to be rooted in the scriptures, and so it's important to have some techniques in our toolbox for how to make that effective in class. So the first thing to keep in mind is what your role is as the teacher, and that is as the conductor, basically, right? A conductor of like an orchestra or a band, where you choose the pieces and you set the pace and create the flow, but the actual work is being done by the members of the orchestra, or in this case, the members of your class. So what are some best practices for reading the scriptures out loud? One of them is that we want to make sure that we use silence and that we use eye contact in order to emphasize things. So all too often we speak too quickly in class, and I'm so guilty of this. But if we slow down and allow some silence, then we allow the meaning of the scripture to really sink into the hearts of our students. So if we are reading scriptures out loud, make eye contact with the members of the class and use silence, use pauses in order to add emphasis and in order to help allow some think time. Also, before any scripture is read, whether it's a single verse or a series of verses, give the look-fors ahead of time. Say things like, watch for how so-and-so does this, or look at how many different ways we can see this, or count the verbs or the adjectives or the people or the mistakes or the good things or this. Give them something to count. Ask them, the key word is this. The key word in our lesson today is atonement. How is that connected to this verse? As we read this verse, think about how important it is to an understanding of the doctrine of, and then fill in the blank. So before they engage with the scripture, give them something to look for. It's very difficult, and you will encounter a lot of silence if, as a teacher, you tell them after they've read, so what does this scripture tell us about XYZ? That is not a best practice. Don't do that. Always tell them ahead of time what they're going to be looking for. Next is be sure to post the reading verses and page numbers prominently in class. And if you can have that up when the students walk in so that they can see what it is they're going to be working with. Yes, lots of people use digital scriptures, but I still recommend putting the page numbers up there. Those of us who like to use paper scriptures, it's very helpful to have the page numbers there. So put those up on the board, telling what the scripture passages are going to be. That enables people, if they want to look ahead and bookmark them so that it's faster to turn to them during the actual class. Have scriptures on hand for those people who don't bring them or forgot to bring them. Having extra sets of scriptures on hand from the works that you're going to be using in class that day is really critical. Next, encourage preparation by having a teaser for the next lesson at the end of this one. Let's say that next week you're going to be covering the story of Daniel in the scriptures. Make sure that you say something like, we're in the lion's den next week, right? So, or something like that. Give a little hint of what's to come to encourage that. Next is avoid round robin reading. So we're all familiar with round robin reading from 3rd grade, where I read a verse, then she reads a verse, then he reads a verse, then they read a verse. And this is just not effective in class. And one of the reasons is that as soon as I stop reading, I'm really not paying attention. I know it's not coming back to me, and it just goes and it becomes samey. One thing that's also difficult is that although it seems counterintuitive, the person who's actually doing the oral reading is probably not understanding it that much. It's a totally different verbal task to read out loud than it is to comprehend what you're reading. And it's much easier to comprehend when you're reading silently to yourself. And so one of the things that teachers sometimes have a habit of doing is to have somebody read something and then ask that person a question about it. That can be difficult because then they have to actually read it again to themselves. You may have encountered that yourself. That phenomenon is interesting and odd, but true. So round robin reading is not good, and neither is asking somebody to read out loud and then asking the question about that reading without giving them any time to think about it. Next is to make sure that you give time for reflection. So once we have a scripture read, we've got to look for, then we have a scripture read, then we want to give a little think time before we start answering. So you can say, in this scripture, we're going to be looking for XYZ, and then after the scripture is read, we're going to take 5 seconds of think time, and then I'll be calling on people. And so build in that think time. Some of the people in the class are going to be quick thinkers, and some are going to be deep thinkers. And you're going to get better quality responses if you allow the deep thinkers time to think. As soon as one person raises their hand, all thinking in the class mostly will stop. And so it's important to build that think time in. Next is embrace the brain. So I would like you to meet neuroscience. We cannot fight neuroscience if we want to be effective in reading out loud in class. So one of the things that we have to make sure that we're not doing is putting our students' reticular activating systems to sleep. That's the part of the brain that determines whether you're going to pay attention or not. And so one of the ways that we can do that is by avoiding lengthy reading of passages. So I would suggest that you read no more than 3 verses in a row without discussion, fewer if they are long verses. For instance, in something that has a very long verse that's half of a column in the scriptures, you won't want to read that, even that one verse. You would want to break that up. So make sure that you're breaking up the reading. No long passages. It's impossible to sustain attention that way, or at least maybe not impossible, difficult. So I follow the 3-2-1 rule. 3 verses, 2 questions about those verses, and then 1 connection of that verse to the topic or prior learning about the scriptures or doctrine. The goal really is to create these micro lessons. Essentially, every time you're going to read a scripture in class is an opportunity for a micro lesson about that scripture. And if you can keep it contained in that, then you can embrace the brain's need for change. Make sure that you give those listen fors. We talked about that. Give the backstory. Set the scripture up. What's happened here? Make sure that you put the scripture in context. If the scripture is out of context, then you're setting your students up for misunderstanding. When that happens, then sometimes you will be more likely to get off-topic, tangential comments, misinterpretation that can actually be damaging. So you want to make sure that you set up the context. Luckily, that's readily available. You can look at how it's been used by church leaders in the past, or where you've seen it in church magazines, publications, or where it's cross-referenced with other scriptures. You may want to share a different perspective. So how did this person in this verse feel about it compared to this other person? Or choose another person from the scriptures. How would James have felt about this versus Isaiah, right? So just using different people's perspectives can help you deepen it. Bring out the emotion that's in the scripture. What would the person have been feeling? Or what feeling are we expected to have? There is emotion in almost every scripture, and tapping into that emotion is brain friendly. It's okay to bring a little humor in. Not raucous, obviously, because you want to maintain the reverence and the quiet reverence that enables the Spirit to be there. But don't shy away from something that seems funny. Obviously, avoid anything that would be off color or offensive in any way. That will drive the Spirit away very quickly. But don't be afraid of a little humor. You hear humor all the time used by leaders of the church. So appropriate humor is a great way to keep the brain engaged in what's going on. Encourage memorization of the scriptures. Richard G. Scott has given a beautiful talk that shares the importance of memorizing the scriptures, and it's powerful to memorize scriptures. So if there are scriptures in the scripture block that you're working with that particularly lend themselves to memorization or would benefit somebody to have memorized, point that out and maybe even spend some time in class working on memorizing that scripture a little bit. So what are some in-class strategies? You want to make sure that you prepare question stems about the scripture that include one of 3 things. First would be an emotion. Have I or someone I know felt this similar emotion or have been in a similar situation? Have I ever felt this way? The second is experience, and that is what I actually just said, which is, have I ever had an experience like this? Do I know anybody who's had an experience like this? What is the modern day equivalent of this experience? So we're looking at similarity of emotion, similarity of experience, and then the third part is connection. What lesson can I learn from my life from this story? And what lesson should this person have learned? How could someone else have benefited from the lesson of this? If you can make a connection on one of those three levels, whether emotion, experience, or the lesson, then it will be a powerful experience. That's what they call likening the scriptures unto us, right? Next, you can look up the etymology of different words within them. There are lots of online resources for looking up etymology. If you just type in the word etymology and then the word you're looking at, it will show you. You can also use scriptural commentaries to find out meanings of words, particularly those in the Old and New Testament that may have been written in Hebrew, Latin, or Greek. And that etymology can often give you real insight into what's going on in the scripture. In fact, sometimes you can't really understand the scripture unless you know the etymology of the word. Next, have you considered actually using the scripture helps that are there for you? The maps, the footnotes, the topical guide, the Bible dictionary, all of these things really enrich our study and are there for our use. We should definitely be looking at those things. Maps in particular are powerful with their visual image. Now, there's also a role for silent reading in classes, asking people to read silently and then having discussion afterwards. Not only is that good because it changes things up a little bit, but also if you're reading to yourself, then you are involved, right? Everybody's engaged if they're reading. So you are going to have to make sure that you have either a set of scriptures available for everybody or that you display the scripture in a way that everybody can see. One of the things that's fun to do in class with scriptures is to try annotating just one verse. Take a single verse out of the scripture block and annotate it. Look up the meanings of words. Have people look up the etymology right there. They've got a phone. Everybody has a phone. Have them look up the etymology. Look up the footnotes. Cross-reference it with other scriptures and fully annotate this verse. One of the ways that you can do that is to write the verse very largely on a whiteboard or a chalkboard and then add in what the class members find. It's easiest on a whiteboard because then you can use different colors of markers. There's a handout linked below where you can go download a handout that has all of this, and there'll be some links to where you can find resources for this, including a slide deck. So that may be helpful for you as well. Use music to set up the scripture. Use appropriate music that will enable people to feel connected either on an emotional level or a content level, the subject of it. Use scripture chains where you're moving from one related scripture to another. Use glue-ins where you actually give people a physical copy that they can glue in of a quote or a picture, glue into their scriptures. In the scriptures, if you're logged in on your phone and you can use it, you can annotate right there. So tell them how to do that, demonstrate how to do that, and link it. If you don't know, find out so that you can tell them how to do it. One activity that you can use with scriptures is called Think, Pair, Share, where you share the scripture and the question about it, give them some think time, ask them to turn to a partner and share with each other. This works especially well when people aren't comfortable sharing with the whole group, but they may be comfortable sharing with somebody right next to them. It also helps prevent the same people from commenting all the time. We want to build bridges over skipped verses. So for instance, let's say the scripture block had verses 1 through 31, but you're going to read verses 1 through 6 and then 18 through 20 and then 28 through 31. So you've got these gaps. You build those bridges and you build them ahead of time. So think of a few words that would guide you from one block of scripture to the next. Otherwise, it's clear in your mind how they're connected because you prepared for the lesson. I hope. You prepared for the lesson, right? You prepared for the lesson, but your class didn't. And so they might not know what's in that gap. And then the connection between the next block of scripture and the first one might not be as obvious to them as it was to you. And you could lose a lot of energy, and you could also lose the context and meaning, in which case then you lose all purpose of using the scripture. So make sure that you build a bridge from one block to another. Listen and read commentaries that have been written on these scriptures so that if questions come up, you know, even if you don't want to answer it in the class, you know how to guide people to an answer about it. Now, one of the things that's important is to improve oral reading skills, to help people improve their oral reading skills. Now, if you're working with really young people who are still developing their own reading, then I think this is something that can be done as a whole class. And my background is as an English teacher, and so I really see the value in learning oral reading skills. And I've taught oral reading skills even at the high school level. So I think it's fine to do it as a whole class, to just take a few minutes to share what makes for a good oral reading skill. And there's more information in the handout, but I'll share some of the things that they are. One of the things is that you must understand what you're reading. You will never be good at reading orally if you don't actually comprehend what you're reading. So you may want to give people their reading assignment ahead of time so that they can look it over and read it, especially if you have reluctant readers. Telling them a week before and then following up with a text or an email or a phone call saying, remember, you're going to be reading Matthew 5:26 in class, then that can help them. And maybe even going over it with them. Like, this is what this scripture means. And then they know they're going to be reading that out loud. If you understand what you're reading, it will be better read out loud. Read to punctuation. One of the problems with scriptures is that the columns are narrow, and so a lot of times sentences are broken up frequently, right? The same sentence might be broken up 3 or 4 times. So we have to help people learn to read to the punctuation, not just to the end of the line. Read to the comma. Comma is a pause. Read to the period or a colon or a semicolon, which would be a longer pause. So they need to learn to read to punctuation. We also want to scan for unfamiliar words. So if we are going to assign reading, we should scan ahead what words are going to be unfamiliar. Oops. What words are going to be unfamiliar to our students? Sorry about that. What words are going to be unfamiliar? So if we know that a word is going to be unfamiliar, then we should tell them how to pronounce it. And if you give somebody reading to do printed out, then print the word and then in parentheses spell it out phonetically so that they won't stumble over it. It's embarrassing to stumble over words. Nobody wants to stumble over words, and you don't want to set your students up for that. Next is to practice reading differently, meaning read quickly, read slowly, read loud, read in a whisper. Practice reading differently will improve the oral reading skill. Reading the same verse over and over, emphasizing a different word each time, is also helpful. Try reading as if you're super tired, as if you're super excited, as if you're selling something, or as if you're very formal, like you're a BBC producer, like you're presenting on the BBC. So read in lots of different ways. Record yourself and listen. Almost everybody's phone can record them, and then they can listen to themselves reading whatever they're going to be reading. Tab the pronunciation guide in your scripture, or bookmark it in your digital scriptures so that you can quickly get to the pronunciation guide in case you come across a name or a word with which you're unfamiliar. So we have one vocabulary that we understand what we hear, one that we understand what we read. We have a different vocabulary that's our speaking vocabulary, and a different vocabulary that's our writing vocabulary. And so lots of times we think that people know a word because they can read it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they can speak it. A lot of times we've heard words that we all know, but pronounced very differently because people have grown used to reading them but not speaking them. For example, I was actually in 9th grade before I realized that subtle and subtle were the same word. No lie. So we have these different vocabularies, and our students in our class have those as well. Keeping that in mind will help us not assume that they know words that they don't. Now, if you have young readers or struggling readers, give them a bookmark. I just make them out of a cereal box that I cut out, and I use an X-Acto knife to cut out a square the same size as the width of a column of scripture so that it can isolate that scripture. That's a technique that I learned from working with students who have dyslexia or emerging readers, and it works really well with young readers. It's just helping them focus in on the line or the word that they're expected to learn right now. Again, assign reading ahead of time. Give specific scavenger hunt tasks. So find the colors, find the adjectives, find the verbs, find the names. One of the things that you could do is bounce to the teacher every other verse. A lot of times, good readers will struggle listening to poor readers read out loud. So rather than having one student after another read, it might be good to have a student read, and then the teacher reads, and then a student reads, and then the teacher reads, so that students are hearing good, strong reading. And as teachers, we should practice our reading. We should be good, strong readers, knowing unfamiliar words before we come into class. That means, friends, that you cannot prepare your lessons sitting in sacrament meeting. You have got to prepare ahead of time. Next is use a rebus or other pictures, right? Use the rebus or where they substitute the words with pictures, and you can use those for very young readers who can't read yet at all. Use marking tools like colored pencils or markers or pens or post-it notes, anything with that will help people to engage with the text itself will improve reading. Next, circle the verses read. Rather than highlighting the whole verse, just circle the number that's been read. Avoid rewarding for reading scripture. We only reward things that we want people to do that we don't think they'll want to do. So don't reward people for reading scriptures. It sends a message that reading scriptures is undesirable, and that's not a message that we want to send. So don't reward that. Next, there are some specific practice techniques. Read phrase by phrase and have them repeat. So you read a phrase, then they read a phrase. You read a phrase, they read a phrase. Read aloud while they follow along silently. And what you can do is then pause every now and then for them to say the next word, right? I, Nephi, having been born of goodly, and then they say parents, and you use your tone inflection to signal that. So then that allows them to follow along. They hear good reading, but they're also participating. Next is read aloud together. Have everybody read aloud together, adjusting the speed or volume. If the readers are doing well, then you speak softly. If they're struggling, you speak more loudly so that they can kind of follow you. It works the same as it does with singing. If a reader struggles with the word, make sure that you correct the pronunciation before moving on, right? So, because otherwise the reader will hear it wrong. Now, what you don't want to do, though, is rob the struggle. Let them struggle with it a little bit. You may want to create a clue that they will use to signal when they want your help. Don't just jump in and assume that they're not going to get there. But if they do say a word incorrectly, have a very nice way of saying it correctly. So, for instance, you might say, yeah, that is a tricky word, isn't it? It's actually pronounced blah, 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 blah. Or, I used to say it that way, and then I found out that it should be said this way, right? So correct it so everybody hears the right way, and you may actually want to write out the phonetic spelling on the board. Next, give the reader a signal that they want to continue along. So meaning that have a signal that they can give you so that you know whether they're done reading or whether they want to keep going. That way you don't have to interrupt them, but you also don't leave them there dangling and uncomfortable. Next, have readers listen to an audio recording of the text, maybe one that you yourself even made ahead of time or somebody that they know. What a fun thing to have some other leader in your congregation read a scripture out loud, or some other member of the congregation, even parents or siblings of people in the class, and then they listen to that and guess who it was. That's a really fun one. I actually recommend that. I should have put it first. Next, make sure that you use variety. Echo, where you repeat what I say, choral reading, which we've talked about, having them read alone in short segments. Kids don't have to read a whole verse, right? They can read just a phrase, read to a comma. Hopefully all of these things will help you have good scriptures out loud in your class. Be sure to look in the description below to find a link to the slide deck that goes along with this and also the handout. And enjoy reading the scriptures in your class.